Test. All right, it works. That was a very kind intro. Thanks very much for that. Excited to be here and share what Enterprise has taught me about Node.js. Before we do that, I just want, for the folks who are here, I think this conference has been amazing, and I would just like to have everybody show our appreciation to the organizers. Organizing something like this is a lot of work, so let's give it up for the organizers. All right, so I'm Aaron. A few weeks ago, I was talking to Dan Shaw, who approached me about giving a talk about scale at PayPal. And, scale can be defined a couple different ways. Initially, before I started working at PayPal, I was thinking, yeah, I really want to learn about how to run Node at scale. PayPal, I knew, was using Node in production, had been using it for years. I knew they had, a lot of traffic, et cetera, but it also made me think about, kind of reflecting on my career and what have I been learning about people scale, how you scale out ideas into big groups of people. And, PayPal is a large company. We've got, we have a lot of traffic, like I mentioned, scale. We have like 350 million requests a day on a single Node.js app. It's our biggest app, but that's a lot of traffic, I think, in my opinion, and I thought that would be interesting. And, on US Black Friday week, it was around 491 million requests a day for a single app, and that's one out of hundreds. But, it's kind of cool. I thought it's cool. I thought the scale of PayPal was cool. I was excited to, share some of the nerdier stuff, but also the people things, too. And so reflecting back on my, past 8 years or so with Node.js, I've worked on a number of different types of projects using Node, anything from web apps to database drivers and real-time communication stuff with Socket.io and things like that, wearable tech, web frameworks, all the stuff. I think Node is a good fit for all of these things. I'm really biased because I've been using it for so long, but also I've used it in a number of different people roles, and so I kind of I'm splitting this talk to half about the nerdier scale of the technology and the scale of Node.js in regards to how it's impacting scaling out to the people in your organization. So I'm going to cover some things I've learned in small companies, very small, to mid-sized companies to large. We'll end up with PayPal and land there. So I started using Node back actually at the end of 2009 and put my first prototype in production in February 2010. This was kind of insane, but Node 0.1.26 was what I shipped it with, and I think 1 week later it didn't run anymore because all the core APIs changed. So a little bit risky, I admit, and yes, I wasn't a big company then, but it was just a small prototype. I had discovered Node watching Ryan Dahl's talk that he gave at NodeConf EU 2009. It was recorded. I watched it. I thought, man, I'm a web developer. I've used a lot of different back-end tech over the last several years, PHP and Rails, a lot of .NET, a lot of C#. But I always kind of felt constrained, and seeing Node pop up that fully embraced JavaScript, the language, which is a language I loved and still love, empowering me to develop things in the back end finally was just like, okay, no brainer. I'm going to use this as much as I can, hopefully. So I was looking for a prototype, and I built one out. Just some simple stuff. Node did not come, it still does not come with batteries included. That's sort of the approach. And instead it relies on the ecosystem around it, and I'll get into more of that. But what I wanted to just point out was this was insane, foolish, but I'm glad I did it. In fact, some of the things I learned about that really helped me turn the corner was that the community around it was mind-blowing to me at the time. I'm sure there have been other communities in the past that have been like this, or maybe not. I just had never been aware of one like this before. And what I mean is, like, I could go to the Google group, and I would just kind of lurk there and read everybody's posts and figure out, like, okay, hey, they're trying to do this, and how does that work? And I'd ask my own questions, they'd be answered. But there's a group there of systems developers, server developers, web nerds, front-end developers, just a super wide range of tech interests coming together and getting excited about this new platform, like this potential behind it. I don't know. It was really motivating for me, and that gave me a lot of confidence to then be even crazier, to build my own startup on top of that a few months later, in summer 2010. So again, I guess I wasn't afraid of taking risk at the time, and so early summer, late spring, I was working on my own startup with a friend. We built it on Node.js. We used MongoDB as well because it was so similar to the JavaScript development pattern. So I had JavaScript on the front end, JavaScript on the server side, and basically a JavaScript console for working with my database. So super risky, nascent technology. This is just new stuff. It didn't have basic tools, so I had to go shopping for a web framework. And I think there were about 3 that I seriously considered at the time. Express was one of them. It had about 190 stars on GitHub, and I thought, that looks like a pretty good project to use for my whole company. It didn't even have cookie support, right? This thing had like nothing. But I had confidence in it because it had a lot of, I thought it was pretty well designed. It was flexible. It had a plugin architecture. This was before Express 1.0, so it was a completely different set of APIs. I mean, literally everything had been thrown out for 1.0. So before that, this is when I was using it. Along the way, what I'm trying to get at is, I'm growing more deeply into the Node.js ecosystem at this time. I'm getting more and more involved with GitHub, and so on my own project, I needed to write tools that didn't exist. There was nothing to do some of the stuff that I needed to do. So I wrote the code. Whether or not it was good doesn't really matter. I wrote it. I made it open source. I tried to document it. People started getting interest, and they were finding bugs in my own project. So key lesson for me was, by open sourcing this possibly disastrous product, people could find problems with it, report them to me. I can address them before they hit my users, and my users are seeing that themselves and experiencing some negativity there. So I could get ahead of the game. It's kind of a win-win situation. At that time, GitHub Node.js wiki pages were the best place to find modules. Believe it or not, there was a page with I think there were 60 modules at some point. It was a growing list, and it got to be 100, and then 150, 200, and you Control F or whatever and search for a module. Maybe there's something on here that does cookies, just whatever. Kind of crazy time. So I ended up selling that a few months later. My friend and I sold it, and I went to work at a company called LearnBoost, another startup, but 400% more people. So we had about 8, and this was a really cool adventure for me. I learned a lot, and I'm going to focus on one specific area that I learned about, and it applies directly to Node. And just a fun fact: NPM 1.0 came out during the time that I was working there, so this is still way back 2011. What I mainly learned at LearnBoost, and I learned a lot, was how to go about open sourcing a project. I think this is very relevant for this crowd. Node.js to me and open source are just peanut butter and jelly. They go together. The project itself is open source. All these modules are available and are open source. So learning how to contribute and help this ecosystem was very important to me individually, and it was important to us as a company. So here's some things that I found that were very effective in open sourcing a project. The best projects the projects that we open sourced that seemed to matter the most were ones that solved real problems. We had we were in a unique position at the time because Node was new, and there was a huge lack of standard tools by today's, during today's, if you look around NPM, you can find any number of tools to develop a web app or do server-side image rendering or templating. etc. None of these things were in existence. So we were solving a lot of problems. We open sourced them by designing our software to be open sourced. We knew we were going to do this. We had to think more carefully about the APIs that we were putting in the software that we were going to open source. We wanted to make these easier to use. Sort of that developer experience side of thing, the mirror of the UX is the DX, and having those nice APIs also meant we could just cut that thing off if we didn't want to use it, and we throw it out, because write your code so it's easily deleted. It makes your life easier. The timing of this software, as I mentioned, we were launching these when there wasn't a lot available in the ecosystem. And so when we would release a project that really solved the problem, it made waves. And if you're ever in a situation like this, and I know it doesn't happen very often, but if you find yourself using an earlier stage technology in your company, I encourage you to open source the problems that you're solving, because it attracts attention to the work that you are doing and your team is doing, and then people want to come work for you. So, everybody's winning here. They're getting to use the software that you're working on. They're fixing bugs, opening features, maybe a PR for new features. That's helping your company, and people are excited about your company from an engineering standpoint. So that's a bonus. But I do want to point out that if you go too far, just make sure when you open source a project, you acknowledge that it's not, you're not done. Like it's work. Because what happens, I don't know how many of you have seen a project that you are considering using, and there's like no activity, there's no commits on the thing for like 18 months or whatever, a year, 6 months even. How does that make you feel? Like, are you going to use that? How many would use that? Raise your hand. How many would use a project that hasn't been touched, no commits in 6 or more months? I would use it just because some of them are done and they're like really good, but I would wonder if it's supported or not. 18 months is like, dang, I don't know if I should touch it. Maybe I'll open an issue and ask, but it does make you wonder, and it is work. A project comes with support. People ask questions. If you've got if you're doing it right and you're kind of polishing this thing up before you release it, you got a website, docs, maybe a forum, Slack, whatever. People are asking questions. You need to answer those questions and help, or the excitement around your projects just falls away. You lose that momentum, and it's a slow death for that thing. Anyway, so those are some of the things that I was picking up at the time, and one of the projects we open sourced was called Mongoose, which is a module, it was a document modeler for MongoDB within Node.js. I had been spending more and more time on this project, getting more interested in just supporting it. This was free time. This wasn't my job. Like I said, it's work. And I was just so excited about it, though, that I was doing it on my nights and weekends when my wife wasn't looking. But MongoDB ended up tracking me down, and I agreed to go work for them 100% of my time on this project. So now I was going to focus on open source completely. I was going to help Node.js community, and I was going to help the MongoDB community, both things that I was passionate about. So scale of the company of MongoDB now, much bigger. We went from like 8 to 10 people now to 100, and we grew to 350 while I was there, and that was just like 18 months. So we were growing very quickly. I want to just focus on a few things about what I learned there. So focusing 100% of my time on an open source project with many more engineers. Now we're, instead of working with just a few folks around me, I've got thousands of engineers. The Mongoose project really grew a lot over the few years that I was maintaining it. And every little bug started to become a big deal to people. This is where the scale of the people comes into play here. When I was working on my, the smaller companies, the smaller projects, the smaller modules, whatever, it's just a little bug, and I'll get to it. It's not a big deal. But man, when there's so many people using it, that if your bug corrupts their database, it's not a small bug. It's a huge issue. So my quality bar had to be raised. The aspects of communicating clearly and quickly in certain circumstances is vital. This applies open source or inside your company. You know, if you've got something that needs to be communicated quickly, it's a big deal that you get that right, and because if you don't, you get a mountain of more support upon you, and people are upset and confused. So take your time to get choose the words carefully, but do it promptly. Again, this basic things like just when you release your project, use a structure. Figure out a plan for your software releases. Have your release notes. Group them up by different categories. These are new features. These are bug fixes. These are maybe it's a breaking change, whatever. Call those things out. Make it very clear. If they have any questions, also include the communication, like contact information in there, and then make sure you are blasting it out in all the various channels that you support officially. Just do it the same way every time. I think being consistent really helps people understand and trust your project a little more. Another thing for me that I picked up was that as we moved along and this project grew, and there was a lot of modules around the MongoDB Node.js ecosystem, to keep up, you kind of have to fix those bugs that you notice along the way. I run into this every month or so. I'll be talking to somebody different, or maybe I'll be reviewing a pull request for somebody, and maybe there's a comment that's out of date, or maybe it's a little bug, or the variable that was already there, is named something super confusing like A. And I encourage you to fix that stuff as you go along. It's easy to say, I don't have time right now. This is not my focus. I'm supposed to be working on feature XYZ. That's out, that was already there. I'm not going to touch it. I encourage you to touch it. I encourage you to clean up the garbage that's laying around you. This is your house. This code base is where you live, in my view. And I just don't want to walk around slipping on bananas and other trash. Like, I want to, clean that up. I don't want to live in a dump. So I recommend you do that. It helps you keep up with the health of the project as you're going. Otherwise, that stuff builds up, and you end up with like a mountain that you can't possibly climb later without massive investment. Okay, so leading the last bullet point on here is the thought that transitions to the next section, which was that this experience maintaining a large open source project, not as large as Node, but it was a large project, and being surrounded with database engineers and thinking about what their focus is. They're thinking about these different data structures and how to choose the right one to solve this problem, and to make them more efficient, etc., so that the software itself executes efficiently. I started thinking about structures of people, and I was curious, well, are there certain structures for people that help them be more productive and execute more efficiently as well? So ultimately that led me to leave MongoDB and take a job over at Pebble. So Pebble is, again, using Node.js this time. It's a wearables company. We made smartwatches, and this was fun. It was a little smaller scale. I still call it medium scale. People, there's about 50 to 150 people while I was there. And I had the opportunity to lead the web development team. So I want to cut out a lot of the noise from it and just look at the organization of our people. And I've seen this pattern more and more now, and not only in my own experience, there's been at least 3 companies doing something like this, but also it comes up more and more in conversations. So what we had when I joined was, this is a subset, but we had a wide range of engineering disciplines: hardware, firmware, data scientists, analytics folks, mobile engineers, web engineers, front-end people. We had all these horizontal disciplines, and we were organized that way too. As a company, we had, for each of these groups or disciplines, we'd have a manager, an engineering manager. And each group had their own backlog. and it worked. It was fine. But what we noticed when we spent 6 to 9 months working on this huge new release, we noticed some inefficiencies there, and we wondered if we could organize differently. So we used a different people structure. And I think we were very influenced by what are called Spotify squads. If you've never heard of it, Spotify squads, Google it. It's a different way to structure your company and your product teams. So we created these vertical slices across all the horizontal disciplines to then be ideally empowered to have all the resources you need to build the product. So instead of like trying to get your pet item on all of these different engineering discipline backlogs, and hopefully they all align, you instead just slice a group, 2 people, whatever, all the resources you need for your product, and with one backlog across them vertically. That seemed to work. It was a pretty rough transition, but it's an interesting way to organize people, I thought, and if you want to talk to me more about it later, I'm happy to go more in depth with it. But generally, there's a few things there that we noticed when we made that move, and is if you don't have the key thing I want you to leave with on this topic is if you don't have the roles required to execute that product, you're gonna fail. We learned that over and over. So basically, identify all the roles that you need for your product and make sure they're filled before you start, or you're gonna have people just waiting around and frustrated. And the other thing to avoid is if you've got someone in this product group and this product squad, and it's the same person, now you're no longer working autonomously. You have this single point of failure between both squads. That's a bad situation for that employee. I hope that you're never in that situation. It's like you have 2 bosses. That person, that's frustrating. You can't possibly meet 2 different teams' expectations at the same. I mean, maybe you can, maybe you can, but it's hard, and it puts that individual in a bad place. So I recommend not doing that. Okay, and that brings me to PayPal. So I started there about a year and a half ago. Really interested again in the scale, not only of the Node.js at scale, but people. The big company, right? 20,000 or so employees, I guess. 3,000 plus engineers. How many people work at a company with more than 3,000 engineers? Okay, cool. There's like 5 people. How about less than 1,000 engineers? No, that's wrong. More than, whatever. All right, who works at a company less than 100 engineers? Let's just do that. All right. Okay. Cool. So surprise, I really didn't see any huge differences when I walked in the door. The principles and these techniques that I've already shared with you are already in practice at PayPal. So I didn't walk in the door really blown away. They're already using Node. They're embracing open source. Their people architectures are basically product focused, slicing across many different verticals. And we're going through additional evolutions of that right now in like larger scale, bigger groups. But at the core, it's all the same principles, at least that I thought. Ultimately, what I realized though is like at this scale, it's not really about the technology as much. The architecture for auto scaling, stateless servers, on AWS or GCP or any other cloud, or if you're not using a cloud, like we're not using a cloud, you've got your own data centers. It's all kind of the same architecture. Everything kind of becomes a people problem when there's so many people involved. Like how do you scale technology or a change in your organization effectively? And so this was fascinating to me. One thing that I glommed onto actually during the training, so we had like a 2-day tour of PayPal, basically find out about all these different crazy products that PayPal is building and deploying, but also a lot of the ideas that are being disseminated through the organization. And one of these key things is called inner source. And this really resonated with me because this it's like you take open source, and especially when I think open source, I'm really often thinking about Node and its influence on my career, and you apply it inside your company. And in practice, this means you take all your software projects and you put them in we use GitHub Enterprise, you put it in some tool that you can search. Anybody can look at the code. You can go, if you know the name of some service and you're like, well, I need to use it, but I'm not sure, maybe there's a bug, or I'm curious about how it works, you just search for it. You read the code. Like, you could just see what's happening. On the flip side of that, there's one caveat, and if you see how it works, knowing how the sausage is made sometimes is surprising. But also it can tempt folks to abusing private properties and things that aren't publicly exposed. It is a problem in Node. You can just go to that repo, see, if I require, module name / this, that, and the other, I can use that internal thing. Don't do that. Okay, just don't do that. Thank me later. But again, these basic lessons that I had learned a long time ago about running an effective open source project really matters in the enterprise, because now you've got the thousands of people are there. If you're working on platforms like I am, there's thousands of developers using this stuff. The great documentation, the clear communication, the contact info is present. You're offering support for this stuff. All these things matter. Clean APIs, being able to refactor easily. These principles apply within your company now. It's just taking all that and bringing it in. I want to call out now a little rough edge I found within the Node ecosystem. So there were some awesome stats shared in an earlier talk, and I don't have any of those, but this is just how many modules are on NPM. It looks like we're over 600,000 now. We have our own internal version of NPM, but it's the same thing, basically. There's lots of modules there. If you don't have to write the code yourself sometimes. You can just find something that already solved your problem often. Or maybe just solve it again and publish it to NPM again. Maybe that's why there's 600,000. But no, where I'm going with that is this hyper-modularization. It can be a burden for you, just making you aware. There's an app, or there's actually a handful of apps with 1,000 dependencies, okay? This is hard to manage. It's hard to manage, and it's very easy as a product team to look at those dependencies and say, I don't care. I'll update them later, and then not update them. Or, maybe acknowledge that updating them is important. You get those security patches, bug fixes, right? So you just use a package lock with wildcard semvers only and no lock files. And this was my experience was, got this new project, NPM install, run the thing, it doesn't start up. That was one of my first experiences, and I'm like, why don't you have a lock file? And this is why. It was actually, I thought about it, I'm like, I really hate to admit it, but it almost makes sense, because the platform out of the box doesn't have automated support for managing this stuff. There are tools that are available, like Greenkeeper, Renovate, and there are other techniques you can use. There's solutions for it, but out of the box, you don't have a solution for it, and many people aren't aware of that as a problem or how to solve it as a problem. So that's an area, as a platform engineer, those are things that we want to solve for our Node.js ecosystem at PayPal, so that many of these folks don't have to think about those problems. I would also say a key aspect for ensuring quality in open source is using a tool like Travis CI or some other automated CI tools, Circle. We use Jenkins pipelines, but offer it as a platform feature, and automate as much of that stuff as you can. So wrapping things up, in my experience here, strengths of Node.js in the enterprise are that you can apply this open source mentality to your company internally, get those advantages. It's very modularized. You can share modules from one application to another application to yet another very easily. Just npm install. The basic APIs that you're using in Node are like either callbacks or promise-based. It's like, you know, it's really easy to integrate with. It's familiar for web developers. I had a web developer background. JavaScript, it's just JavaScript, like was mentioned earlier. This is not, I mean, we all know, web developers know JavaScript now. So you can, use that to your advantage. If you don't already use Node, I encourage you to use it. And then that community aspect. There's just so many modules available. There's so many good projects. There's so many good teaching resources. Just look at the health of the Node.js project. I was just watching this last talk. It's really impressive. I thought the statistics up there with so many groups, so many commits. There's so much momentum. Get behind it and ride that wave. I think that was really important for PayPal. It was important for basically every company that I just walked through. I'm riding that wave of momentum, and it keeps going. It hasn't gone anywhere at all. So if you're interested in joining PayPal's community, you can join us. You go to visit paypal.com/jobs or chat with me after this talk. I'm happy to give you far more insight or share other fun things that we're doing. So thank you very much.